Imagine a structure covered in gold from floor to ceiling, with stones so perfectly cut that no mortar was needed at the joints. Now imagine that all of this was erected in absolute silence. No hammer, no chisel, no iron tool of any kind on the construction site. This is the true story of how Solomon's temple was built. Before any stone was laid, before any cedar log was cut, there was a man obsessed with a plan he would never see completed. David, king of Israel, a warrior with blood-stained hands, carried a desire that consumed his soul: to build a permanent house for the Ark of the Covenant. The problem is that God said no. The account in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 is straightforward. David had shed too much blood. His hands were made for war, not for sacred construction. But receiving a no from God did not mean sitting idle. David did something that few leaders in history have done. He dedicated the last years of his life to obsessively preparing everything so that his son could accomplish what he himself could not. And the scale of that preparation is staggering. The text of 1 Chronicles chapter 22 records that David set aside 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. To put this in perspective, 1 talent was approximately 34 kilograms. That means we are talking about something around 3,400 tons of gold and 34,000 tons of silver. These numbers are so monumental that historians debate to this day whether they should be interpreted literally or as an expression of extraordinary abundance. But even if they were a fraction of that, the amount of precious metal gathered by a single king in a single generation for a single building has no parallel in the ancient world. David did not stop at metals. He gathered iron in incalculable quantities for nails and hinges. He sent for cedar from Lebanon in volumes so vast that the biblical text says it was impossible to count or weigh. He summoned stonemasons, woodcutters, artisans skilled in iron and bronze, and organized them into work teams before Solomon even took the throne. Everything planned, everything set aside, everything catalogued. The son would only need to execute, and when Solomon finally assumed the throne around 970 before the Common Era, the project came to life. But the execution required something that not even all of David's gold could buy: labor on an absurd scale. 1 Kings chapter 5 reveals the numbers. Solomon conscripted 30,000 men from Israel for compulsory labor. These men were sent to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 per month. They worked 30 days in the cedar forests and had 60 days at home, 1 month of brutal labor and 2 months of recovery. And that was the privileged group. Beyond them, there were 80,000 stonecutters in the mountains and 70,000 carriers, 150,000 men mobilized simultaneously. To supervise this army of workers, Solomon appointed 3,300 foremen. Each foreman was responsible for approximately 45 men, a command structure that rivaled the organization of the greatest armies of the era. Think about the logistics of feeding 150,000 men daily. Think about the water needed, the tools that had to be manufactured, sharpened, and replaced without pause. The inevitable accidents in the quarries and forests. The biblical text records the numbers, but the human suffering behind them requires you to pause and grasp what it meant to be there. The quarries were likely located below Jerusalem and in the surrounding mountainous regions. Modern archaeological excavations have revealed what may be one of these quarries: a vast underground cavern known as Zedekiah's Cave, or Solomon's Quarries, which extends for more than 200 meters beneath the old city of Jerusalem. There, in near total darkness, illuminated only by olive oil lamps that barely cut through the gloom, men carved blocks of white limestone with copper and bronze tools. The air was thick with stone dust. Ventilation was minimal. The sound of chisels echoed ceaselessly in that confined space, creating a noise that must have been maddening. And here enters the most extraordinary detail of the entire construction. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 7 records something that defies logic. When the temple was being built, only stones prepared at the quarry were used. No hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple during construction. Absolute silence at the construction site. Every stone was cut, shaped, and adjusted with millimetric precision down below in the darkness of the quarries. When it arrived at Mount Moriah, it only needed to be fitted into place. No adjustments, no touch-ups, no noise. To understand the magnitude of this requirement, consider what it meant in practice. Every block of stone, and some were more than 5 meters long according to complementary historical accounts, had to be cut to the exact dimensions of its final destination. The stone cutters in the caves worked with measurements that had been calculated on the surface, transmitted to the quarry, and executed with zero margin for error. If a block arrived at the top of the mount with 1 centimeter too many, it could not be corrected there. It would have to go back or be discarded. The precision required was comparable to that of modern surgery, but performed with tools from 3,000 years ago in the dim light of a cave by exhausted men breathing stone dust throughout entire shifts. The matter of silence was not an engineering whim. It was a sacred commandment. Iron was associated with war, with bloodshed, with violence, and a house for God could not be contaminated by the sound of instruments of destruction. The altar of uncut stones described in Exodus chapter 20 already carried this prohibition. Any stone touched by iron was considered profaned. Solomon took this principle to the extreme, applying it to the entire construction. The result was a construction site that did not sound like a construction site. Men moved stones weighing tons, positioned cedar beams over 10 meters long, fitted monumental blocks together, all in operational silence. The only permitted sound was the controlled dragging of stones and communication among the workers. But before any stone reached the summit, the terrain itself had to be prepared. Mount Moriah was not a flat and convenient surface. It was an irregular, rocky outcrop with significant elevation changes. To create a platform stable and level enough to support a monumental structure, colossal preliminary work was necessary, retaining walls, landfill, leveling of the natural rock. Every decision had to account not only for the weight of the building itself, but the weight of the gold covering, the interior structures, the sacred objects, and the flow of people in the surrounding courtyards. When the foundation was ready, the actual construction began. The dimensions of the temple, described in 1 Kings chapter 6, were precise: 60 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. Converting to modern measurements, approximately 27 meters in length, 9 meters in width, and 13.5 meters in height. Compared to medieval cathedrals or Greco-Roman temples, it was not a gigantic building, but the grandeur of Solomon's temple was never in its external dimensions. It was in what lay inside. The interior was divided into 2 main chambers. The first, called the Holy Place, occupied 2/3 of the total length, 40 cubits. The second, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube of 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. A cube. Absolute geometric perfection. This detail alone reveals the level of precision the builders achieved. Creating a perfectly cubic space with the tools and techniques of the 10th century before the Common Era was no trivial matter. Any error in the foundations, any tilt in the floor, any deviation in the walls would compromise the sacred geometry of the most important space in the entire building. And both chambers were covered in gold, not painted, not superficially gilded, covered. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 21 says that Solomon covered the interior of the temple with pure gold and extended gold chains before the Holy of Holies. The floor was gold, the walls were gold, the ceiling was gold. The doors were of carved olive wood covered in gold. The cherubim sculpted on the walls were covered in gold. The sensation of entering that space, with oil lamps reflecting off golden surfaces on every side, must have been one of supernatural luminosity, as if the very air were glowing. In the Holy of Holies stood two enormous cherubim, carved from olive wood and covered in gold. Each one was 10 cubits tall, approximately 4.5 meters. The wingspan of each, with wings outstretched, was 10 cubits. Together, the wings of the two cherubim touched the two opposite walls and met in the center, directly above the spot where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed. 20 cubits from wingtip to wingtip, the entire width of the room covered by golden wings. The Ark would rest protected beneath this canopy of gold and wood, in a space where no natural light entered, and where only one person in the world was permitted to set foot, the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement. But the temple was not merely walls and gold. Around the main building, Solomon constructed a side structure of 3 stories, auxiliary chambers that surrounded the temple on 3 levels. The lower floor was 5 cubits wide, the middle one 6, and the upper one 7. This progression occurred because the outer walls of the temple were built with recesses. Each level was slightly narrower, creating supports for the beams of the next floor, without any beam penetrating the sacred wall of the temple itself. Pure engineering, solving a structural problem with elegance and respect for the sacred space. And there was bronze. A great deal of bronze. For the work with this metal, Solomon brought Hiram of Tyre, not King Hiram, but an artisan of the same name, the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a Tyrian father. 1 Kings chapter 7 describes Hiram as a man full of wisdom, understanding, and skill to perform every kind of work in bronze. This man was responsible for some of the most impressive pieces in the entire temple complex. The 2 bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, were placed at the entrance porch. Each pillar was 18 cubits tall, approximately 8 meters, with a capital of 5 cubits on top. The circumference of each pillar was 12 cubits. They were hollow, with walls approximately 4 fingers thick. To cast pillars of this size, Hiram needed enormous molds, furnaces capable of melting tons of bronze simultaneously, and a team that mastered casting techniques that many later civilizations would still struggle to replicate. The casting work was carried out on the plain of the Jordan, in the dense clay between Succoth and Zarethan, where the soil was ideal for creating casting molds. Hiram also created the Sea of Bronze, a colossal circular basin measuring 10 cubits in diameter, 5 cubits in height, and 30 cubits in circumference. The wall thickness was 1 handbreadth. This basin held 2,000 baths of water, something around 44,000 liters. 44,000 liters of water supported by 12 bronze oxen, 3 facing each cardinal direction. The weight of this structure, when full, must have exceeded 50 tons. Think about the challenge of casting a single piece of bronze 10 cubits in diameter with only a handbreadth of thickness. Any air bubble in the metal, any flaw in the mold, any variation in the furnace temperature meant starting from 0, with tons of molten bronze wasted. In addition to the Sea of Bronze, Hiram produced 10 bronze stands with wheels, each measuring 4 cubits in length, 4 in width and 3 in height. On top of each stand, a bronze basin with a capacity of 40 baths, approximately 880 liters. These movable stands were decorated with lions, oxen, and cherubim, and served for transporting the water needed for purification rituals. 10 complete structures, each weighing hundreds of kilograms, all produced with the same level of artistic detail. The list of bronze objects that Hiram fabricated seems endless. Pots, shovels, sprinkling basins, all the utensils for the altar. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 47 makes a statement that reveals the total scale. Solomon left all these utensils unweighed because there were so many that the weight of the bronze was not determined. So much bronze that they gave up weighing it. And there was wood. The cedar of Lebanon was the quintessential noble material of the ancient world, resistant to insects, aromatic, durable for centuries, with a reddish tone that darkened over time. Solomon made an agreement with Hiram, king of Tyre, for the continuous supply of cedar and cypress. In return, Israel provided wheat and olive oil, 20,000 cors of wheat and 20 cors of pure olive oil per year. The cedars were cut in the mountains of Lebanon, dragged to the coast, tied into rafts, and transported across the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa. From Joppa, they were carried overland to Jerusalem, a distance of approximately 55 kilometers, climbing more than 700 meters in elevation. Each log weighed tons, and hundreds of them were needed. The cedar wood lined all the interior walls of the temple, from floor to ceiling. No stone was visible from inside. Over the cedar, carvings of open flowers, palm trees, and cherubim. Over the carvings, gold. The sequence was stone, carved cedar, and gold. 3 layers of noble material, each requiring different specialists, stonemasons, carpenters, and goldsmiths, working in perfect coordination. The temple floor was made of cypress boards, covered in gold. The doors of the Holy of Holies were of olive wood, with 5-sided doorposts, carved with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, all covered in gold. The doors of the holy place were of cypress, also carved and gilded. Every detail was intentional, every surface was treated. There was not a single square centimeter of that interior that had not been worked by human hands. The inner courtyard was enclosed by 3 rows of dressed stone and 1 row of cedar beams. This alternation of stone and wood was not merely decorative, it served as earthquake protection, functioning as a buffer between the rigid layers of stone, an intuitive anti-seismic technique that would not be formally rediscovered for millennia. And how was the logistical machine of 150,000 workers fed over the course of 7 years? The answer lies in the tax system that Solomon imposed on Israel. 1 Kings chapter 4 lists 12 administrative officers, each responsible for a region of the country, and each region responsible for supplying the royal court for 1 month of the year. The daily consumption of Solomon's court, which included workers and officials, was 30 cor of fine flour, 60 cor of regular flour, 10 fattened oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, and 100 sheep, plus deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl per day. Multiply that by 365 days, and then by 7 years. The human cost went beyond food. In the underground quarries, the workers' life expectancy was drastically lower. The limestone dust inhaled constantly destroyed lungs. Accidents with stone blocks weighing several tons were inevitable and frequently fatal. In the forests of Lebanon, felling centuries-old cedars with hand tools was dangerous work. Trunks falling in unexpected directions, branches breaking without warning, mountainous and unstable terrain. In the sea transport, the log rafts faced the Mediterranean. Storms could destroy months of work in a single day, and in the bronze foundries on the plain of the Jordan, men worked alongside furnaces reaching over 1100 degrees, with constant risk of severe burns and inhalation of toxic gases. 7 years, from approximately 966 to 959 before the Common Era. 7 years of stone cut in darkness, cedar dragged across mountains, bronze smelted in hellish furnaces, and gold applied in silence. And when it was finished, the result was something the ancient world had never witnessed. A building that was relatively compact on the outside, but of such absurd interior richness that it made the great Egyptian temples seem austere by comparison. The inauguration, described in 1 Kings chapter 8, was an event of national proportions. Solomon gathered all the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes and the leaders of the families in Jerusalem. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant to the Holy of Holies and placed it beneath the wings of the giant cherubim. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the temple. The glory of God was so dense, so tangible, that the priests could not stand to minister. The building, constructed in silence, was inaugurated with a manifestation that none of those present would ever forget. Solomon then prayed, a long, detailed, deeply theological prayer. He asked God to hear the prayers directed toward that place, prayers of repentance, of supplication in times of drought, of famine, of war. He asked that even the foreigner who came from distant lands and prayed facing that temple be heard. And when he finished the prayer, 2 Chronicles chapter 7 records that fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices, and the glory of God filled the temple once more. The entire people, upon seeing the fire and the glory, fell face down on the ground and worshipped. The inauguration celebration lasted 14 days. Solomon offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep, numbers that defy the imagination. The amount of blood, the number of priests needed, the continuous days of sacrifices, all on a scale that had never been seen and would never be repeated. The regular bronze altar could not accommodate so many sacrifices, so Solomon consecrated the central part of the courtyard as an additional area for offerings. Where did all of this come from? How did a relatively small kingdom in the corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia accumulate enough wealth for a project of this magnitude? The answer lies in strategic location and providential timing. Israel under Solomon controlled the trade routes between 3 continents. Egypt to the south was in a period of relative weakness. Assyria to the north had not yet reached its expansionist peak. Solomon occupied exactly the historical window in which Israel could prosper without being crushed by imperial neighbors. He taxed the caravans crossing his territory, maintained a commercial fleet operating from Etzion Geber on the Red Sea, and received tribute from neighboring kingdoms. The wealth did not come from nowhere. It came from a geopolitical confluence that lasted less than a century. But all that wealth came at a price that the biblical text itself does not conceal. The forced labor imposed by Solomon generated deep resentment among the northern tribes. When Solomon died and his son Rehoboam assumed the throne, the people's first demand was clear: lighten the heavy yoke your father placed upon us. Rehoboam refused, and the kingdom split. The project that united Israel around a monumental work planted the seeds of the division that would fragment the nation forever. The greatest irony of this story is that the most silent building ever constructed became the loudest in human memory. Wars were fought over it, empires fell trying to control it, millions wept over its destruction. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of Solomon's temple is not in its golden walls or its monumental stones. It is in the process, in the silence of preparation, in the invisible precision, in the work that no one sees, but that sustains everything that appears. Every stone was cut before it reached its destination. Every detail was planned before it was executed. Nothing was improvised. What you are building in silence today, with precision, patience, and without applause, may be exactly what will remain standing when everything else crumbles.